Catherine Jeff, welcome to another video. Today I'm going to show you how you can paint this river scene using acrylic. I wanted to show you how you can create the sort of mist effect. That's with dry brushing. So this was the photograph I took of a river as a local Oxfordshire one. I just really like the winter, sort of wintry colours that there were there. So I'm just using primary colours. These are acrylic paints, System 3, Rowney ones, just to get the sort of bright, I really like the bright sort of sky. So just scrubbing that in with a scruffy brush. I'm just using board that's called Greyboard, and I primed it, mixing a green, using those primaries. It's quite sort of, because I wanted it quite misty, I'm using quite a lot of white with these colours. Now here in the distance there's it's very subtle, but there was a sort of strip of green. I sort of made it a bit more yellowy and brighter, but that's artistic license, you can sort of enhance colours. So I just put that in the distance and added more of that colour in the foreground. Just mixing the sort of watercolour here. It's a greeny blue, quite pale again. Now I felt like there was some sort of grasses in the foreground on the riverbank that were quite dry and quite brown and gorgeous rich colours. So I felt like I needed to put those in to get some perspective, and just putting them on the other side, just up and down with the scruffy brush. I've changed brushes there. I'm using a thin flat brush just to get the reflections. So I did water that paint down. All the paint so far hasn't been watered, and the brush has been dry. So just going left to right with that white, just working that in where the reflections are. I'm mixing more of the grass colour, that deep rich brown, and with that flat brush, which I've wetted the paint, I'm just, that shows you there the grasses that I'm replicating. I'm just putting the beginnings of the grasses. There's a lot more work involved later on with those. So I'm just putting distant hedgerows in, just suggestions that there's something in the distance. Obviously further away the colours diminish a bit, so I tend to do more pale colours in the distance. I'm using a thin sort of scruffy brush, again quite dry. I'm just using the wetness of the paint, then you get the sort of fluffy edges, I suppose. It's not all hard edges. So I'm just putting the foliage of the trees that will go on the right hand side, just filling all that in, using that lovely grey wintry colour. They're winter trees, so there's not a lot of leaves on them, if any, so it's just suggesting sort of branches really. I'm just going in with the darker version of that colour here and there, mainly at the bottom as well, because there was sort of solid bushes at the bottom of that section. So I've started putting in the sort of dried leaves and wintry foliage on the trees on the left, and then I needed to add the trunks in, so I knew where I was going with that foliage, so I sort of stopped halfway. Now I've just got a rigger brush now, wetter paint, and you can just paint quite gnarly branches if you give the brush a little bit of a wiggle when you pull the paintbrush out to paint the branch. If you wiggle it a bit, you get a sort of gnarly edge. Now it's always a bit tricky painting the right way up when you're doing trees, branches coming off onto the left side. Usually I'd tilt my board, but for the camera I've left it normal. So if you find you're getting a bit cack-handed, just tilt your painting slightly so it makes it easier. So also using the rigger brush, I just did reflections there and a little bit of shadow on that riverbank. So just going back to the scruffy brush now with that grey colour, sort of grey brown. Now here I'm really pushing the bristles hard into the palette to try and splay them more, and this gives a real nice foliage sort of detail just by dabbing. So I'm just adding in with the rigger brush more trees, a little bit further away. Just always painting from that middle trunk outwards so you get the point. If you did it the other way around you wouldn't get that point. I'm just wiggling a little bit on the reflection just to indicate ripples. I'm just blurring a bit there with my finger. That I use that technique quite a lot actually, because sometimes you paint something on and it feels a bit like it's sat on top of everything else. So if you just blur it with your finger and smudge it almost a bit, it tends to sort of blend a bit more really easily. So more rigger brush branches on the right hand side, like indicating that they're growing from through the leaves, so they're different heights of branches. And I just wanted to put some smaller branches on top, and I've gone darker here as well with that dark tone. Now there were some on the picture, there were some green bushes underneath, so I'm just indicating that green, and because there was suddenly put green on that side, on the right hand side, I felt like I needed to dot that green around, so I'm just dotting that round on the left on the bank there and in the foreground. So if ever you suddenly introduce another colour, if you dot that around, it sort of makes for a more pleasing picture. Again, just still using that scruffy brush. I've just switched to my rigger actually, making a pale green, sort of yellowy green, just to give, I mean there's a lot more work that goes into these, I suppose they're dried reeds or grasses, but this is just the start of all the different sort of layers on that. And I'm putting, just sort of going back a bit, I was doing that colour on the ground, just going left to right rather than up and down, and that again just gives a bit of, like painting like that with a rigger brush, you don't 100% know what's going to happen, so it's quite nice to try and do some ground foliage and not be too in charge of it, so you don't know what you're going to get a lot of the time. Again, doing a bit exactly what I was just saying, but with that reddy brown. Because the bristles are quite long, it sort of flicks the paint around. I suppose it's a bit like painting with a feather, you're not 100% in control. Just darkening, I felt that the riverbank needed a bit more darkening. Misting up where those reflections are a little bit more, making them a bit wider. Now here I'm mixing white just with water. I'm using the rigger brush just to pull through those reflections. To indicate the light on the water there. So doing a little bit more, trying to get some thicker marks in with those grasses and light ones against the dark background further back. Now this is the mist in the distance, so I've got a clean dry, it's important it's dry, scruffy brush. I've just literally got white, I haven't diluted it at all, and I just start off if you first grab the white, if you take any excess off, if you think you've grabbed too much on a tissue, I mean you need hardly any, and just little circles, that's the sort of technique I'm using. And you gradually just layer up. You don't want it too thick, otherwise you're going to hide what you've painted underneath already. And that's not the effect we want. We just want to still see what's underneath but have this sort of misty layer. Now here I've just wetted the brush because just with water, and then I'm just lifting off some before it dries. You have to do this quite quickly because people who use acrylic know that it dries ever so fast. But if you're quick, you can get some of that off. And I'm just putting some frost, indicating some frost on the grass there in the foreground. And I just felt like the grasses still needed a little bit lightening. So I'm just adding some more details in there. I wouldn't do that in the grasses on the other side of the riverbank because you wouldn't see them as much. You know, these are in the foreground, so you can get away with putting a little bit more detail in the foreground. And just finishing off with a little bit of detail, more details. So here's more reflections using a rigger brush in the river from the foliage. Again, working the way that the reflections go, so left to right. And that's the finished painting. Well, I hope you've enjoyed the demo, and why not have a go yourself? Thanks for watching. See you next time.